Damian Blackwood walked into the dimly lit bar, the weight of his past pressing down on him like an iron chain. The neon lights flickered above, casting a moody glow over the polished wooden counter, where weary souls sought solace in whiskey and quiet conversations. He wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to be recognized. He just wanted the memories to stop clawing at him. He slid onto a stool, running a hand through his dark hair, his tailored suit slightly out of place in the casual setting. He had spent years building an empire, acquiring companies, making billions, but no matter how much success he gained, the ghosts of his past still followed him. "What's your poison?" a soft voice asked. He looked up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his mind went still. The bartender was breathtaking. Long, wavy dark hair framed her striking face, her deep brown eyes holding a quiet strength. She wasn't just beautiful, she was captivating. "Whiskey. Neat," he said, his voice lower than usual. The woman gave a small nod, grabbing a bottle from the shelf with practiced ease. "Rough night," Damian let out a humorless chuckle, "something like that." She slid the glass toward him. "Well, whatever it is, this won't fix it." He arched a brow. "Is that the bartender's official stance on drinking?" She shrugged. "Just stating the truth." He took a sip, the burn of the whiskey grounding him. "You always this blunt, only when necessary." She wiped down the counter, her movements fluid and precise. "I'm Vanessa, by the way." Damian didn't usually give his real name in places like this, but something about her made him forget his usual guarded nature. "Damian?" Vanessa studied him for a moment, then leaned against the counter. "You don't look like a Damian." He smirked slightly. "And what does a Damian look like?" She tilted her head. "I don't know, but you look like a man who has everything and yet nothing at the same time." His grip tightened around the glass. She wasn't wrong. Vanessa didn't press, though. She simply moved on to another customer, leaving Damian with his thoughts. He watched her, the way she interacted with people, the way she seemed completely at ease yet held an air of mystery about her. She was different. Hours passed, and Damian found himself still sitting there, listening to the hum of conversation, watching Vanessa move behind the bar with effortless grace. He hadn't intended to stay this long, but there was something about this place about her that made him reluctant to leave. Then, a man at the end of the bar got too loud, too aggressive. Vanessa handled it calmly, but Damian could see the tension in her shoulders. The man reached for her wrist, and before Damian even realized he was moving, he was on his feet, gripping the guy's arm with a force that made the entire bar go silent. "She said no," Damian said, his voice dangerously low. The man paled, muttered an apology, and stumbled out of the bar. Vanessa stared at Damian, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she sighed. "You didn't have to do that." "I did." She studied him for a moment before shaking her head with a small smile. "You're something else, Damian." And for the first time in years, he wanted to be. Damian didn't leave the bar that night, not immediately anyway. Something kept him tethered to that stool, watching Vanessa move behind the counter with quiet efficiency. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. The air inside the bar grew heavier as the night wore on, the scent of aged liquor and faint traces of citrus lingering in the air. The crowd had thinned, leaving only a handful of stragglers nursing their drinks, their conversations reduced to low murmurs. Vanessa wiped down the counter, her movements brisk yet unhurried, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. "You don't belong here," she finally said, not looking up. Damian arched an eyebrow. "And where do I belong?" Vanessa tossed the damp cloth into the sink and leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Somewhere with crystal glasses and people who talk in stock prices." He let out a breath of amusement. "You think you've got me all figured out?" "Not all of you," she admitted, meeting his gaze. But I've seen enough men in suits come through here to know they don't usually stick around unless they're looking to forget something. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She wasn't wrong. And you? He asked, steering the conversation away from himself. You don't seem like someone who planned on tending bar forever. A flicker of something unreadable passed over her face before she shrugged. Plans change. He recognized the evasion instantly. It was the same kind he used when people pried too much. Before he could push further, the door swung open, and a man in a wrinkled button-down stumbled in, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his wallet. He muttered something under his breath before dropping onto a stool a few seats away from Damian. Vanessa walked over without hesitation, pouring a glass of water instead of alcohol. "Not tonight, Jake," she said, her voice softer than it had been with Damian. The man exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Vanessa, please, just one. You know the deal," she said gently. "Water first, then we talk." Something about the way she handled it, the patience, the quiet authority, made Damian watch her more closely. She wasn't just here to pour drinks. She cared about the people who walked through those doors. Jake sighed but didn't argue. He took the water, drinking it in slow sips. Damian noticed Vanessa keeping an eye on him while still tending to the bar, as if she had done this 100 times before. "You look after them," Damian observed. Vanessa glanced at him. "Someone has to." He studied her, the way she carried herself, the way she seemed to bear the weight of more than just her own troubles. "Who looks after you?" She blinked as if caught off guard by the question. For a moment she didn't answer, then she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "I don't need looking after." Damian wasn't sure he believed her. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, and Vanessa started cleaning up, signaling the bar was closing soon. He should have left by now, should have walked out hours ago, but he found himself reluctant to step away from this place, from her. "Will I see you here tomorrow?" He asked, standing and adjusting the cuff of his jacket. Vanessa gave him a long, considering look before tilting her head. "That depends. Are you planning on forgetting something again?" He hesitated, then said, "No." "Then maybe," she replied, turning away to stack glasses. Damian walked out into the cool night air, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was running from something. Instead, he felt like he was walking towards something new entirely. Damian returned the next night. He told himself it was just to clear his head, to enjoy the anonymity the bar provided. But as soon as he stepped through the door, his eyes instinctively sought Vanessa. She was there, tying her apron as she stepped behind the counter. Unlike the night before, she wore a fitted black t-shirt under her usual work vest, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She didn't look up right away, too focused on preparing for the evening rush. Damian took his usual seat, resting his hands on the counter. When Vanessa finally noticed him, she arched an eyebrow, not in surprise but in acknowledgement. "You're back," she said, pouring a drink for another customer. "I am," he replied. She wiped her hands on a bar towel, then leaned slightly against the counter. "Not trying to forget something tonight, are you?" "No," Damian said, holding her gaze. "I think I'm trying to remember something instead." A flicker of something passed through her expression, curiosity, perhaps, but she didn't ask what he meant. Instead, she reached for a bottle and poured him a whiskey without needing to ask. "You don't seem like the kind of man who does things without reason," she said. "So why come back?" Damian considered his response. He could have given her a vague, non-committal answer, but for some reason he didn't want to. "I guess I like the way you see things." Vanessa's lips quirked at the edges, but she shook her head as if amused by his response. "That's a dangerous thing to say. I tend to see more than most people are comfortable with." "I don't mind." She studied him for a brief moment before turning away to serve another customer. He watched her work, noting the way she moved through the space with practiced ease. It was clear she had been doing this for a long time, but there was something else, something deeper. "You don't just run this place," Damian said when she returned. "You protect it." Vanessa exhaled, her fingers tapping idly against the counter. "This bar has been in my family for a long time. It's all I have left of my father." It was the first real piece of personal information she had given him, and Damian didn't take it lightly. He could hear the weight behind her words, the quiet pain she tried to mask beneath her usual composure. "Was he a bartender too?" Vanessa shook her head. "He was a businessman. But this was his escape. He built it from nothing, and when he passed, I couldn't let it go." Damian understood that kind of loyalty, the kind that kept you tethered to something even when it hurt. "Keeping it running must be a lot of work," he said. "It is," she admitted, "but it's worth it." Their conversation was interrupted by a man walking in a sharply dressed figure who carried himself with too much confidence. Damian recognized the type instantly. He had dealt with enough men like him in boardrooms and negotiations. The man strode up to the bar, flashing Vanessa a practiced smile. "Vanessa, we need to talk." Her entire posture shifted, her shoulders tensing. "Not now, Eric." Damian's attention sharpened. Eric leaned against the counter, ignoring her dismissal. "Come on, don't be difficult." "You know the offer still stands." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "And you know my answer hasn't changed." Damian wasn't sure what the offer was, but he could tell Vanessa wanted nothing to do with it. He set his glass down, his presence suddenly heavier. Eric finally seemed to notice Damian and eyed him with mild interest. "Who's this?" "No one you need to worry about," Vanessa said coolly. Eric's smile didn't waver, but there was an unmistakable sharpness beneath it. "You always were stubborn." "And you always were overconfident," Vanessa shot back. Eric exhaled through his nose as if trying to keep his patience. "Think it over again, because sooner or later you're going to have to give me an answer." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving a thick tension in the air. Damian waited until the door shut before he spoke. "What does he want?" Vanessa exhaled, rubbing her temples. "To buy the bar he's been trying for months." Damian frowned. "And you don't want to sell?" "No," she said firmly. "This place isn't just a business, it's my home." He could see how much it meant to her, the way she clung to it not just out of obligation but out of love. "Is he giving you trouble?" Damian asked, his tone losing its usual smoothness. Vanessa hesitated, then shook her head. "I can handle it." Damian wasn't sure he believed her, but he didn't push. Not yet. Instead, he simply said, "If you ever need help, you just have to ask." Vanessa looked at him then, something unreadable in her eyes. And for the first time that night, she didn't have a quick response. Damian had never considered himself a patient man, but when it came to Vanessa, he found himself waiting for her to let him in on her terms. The days blurred into nights, and each evening he returned to the bar, slipping onto the same stool, waiting for her to meet his gaze. It became a ritual one neither of them acknowledged out loud. But it was there, growing between them, unspoken and electric. Vanessa never asked why he kept coming back, and he never gave her an answer. She didn't pry into his past, didn't demand to know the reasons behind the weight he carried. Instead, she let him exist in the space she had built, offering him quiet moments of peace amidst the chaos of the world outside. And yet, he could see the exhaustion creeping into her movements. The tension in her shoulders lingered longer each night. Eric hadn't returned, but Damian knew men like him didn't walk away easily. One evening, after the last customer left and the door was locked, Damian stayed behind, watching as Vanessa stacked the chairs onto the tables. She moved with a quiet determination, but there was something strained about it tonight. He crossed the floor and took the cloth from her hands, setting it aside. "What's wrong?" She exhaled but didn't step away from him. "It's nothing I haven't handled before." "That doesn't mean you should have to handle it alone." Her eyes met his, something flickering behind them: hesitation, vulnerability. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the lights outside flickered and a shadow passed the window. Damian turned just as a loud knock echoed through the bar. Vanessa went rigid. He didn't need to ask who it was. He already knew. Without hesitation, Damian strode to the door and pulled it open. Eric stood there, his expression carefully controlled, but there was an edge to him now, a sharpened impatience. "You're still here," Eric said, his gaze flicking between Damian and Vanessa. Damian didn't move. "You don't belong here." Eric let out a slow exhale. "I came to give Vanessa one last chance to make the right decision." "Get out," Vanessa said from behind Damian. Eric's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." "The mistake would be trusting you," she shot back. Damian took a step forward, his presence filling the doorway. She said no. "That's the only answer you're getting." Eric's eyes narrowed, but whatever he saw in Damian's expression made him hesitate. After a long, tense moment, he turned and stalked away, disappearing into the night. Damian shut the door and turned back to Vanessa. She was standing with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "He's not going to stop," Damian said. She let out a slow breath. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Then, softly, Vanessa said, "Why are you doing this?" "Because I can't stand by and watch someone try to take something from you," Damian said without hesitation. "Because I care." Her breath hitched, and for the first time she didn't try to deflect. She didn't try to push him away. Instead, she closed the space between them. "Damian." He reached for her, the warmth of her skin grounding him. "Tell me to stop and I will," he murmured. She didn't. Instead, she leaned into him, and in that moment, every barrier between them crumbled. Damian had walked into this bar to forget, but Vanessa had given him something else entirely, a reason to want more. Vanessa didn't pull away. Not immediately. For a moment, she let herself rest against Damian, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath, the undeniable heat radiating from him. It was dangerous letting someone get this close. But with him, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt inevitable. Then reality came crashing back and she exhaled sharply, stepping back. Damian's expression didn't shift, but there was something in his eyes, something she wasn't sure how to name. She turned away, grabbing a glass to polish, needing something to do with her hands. "You should go." He didn't argue. He didn't try to coax her into talking. Instead, he studied her for a long moment before nodding. He walked to the door, pausing just before stepping outside. "I'll be back tomorrow." Vanessa's grip on the glass tightened, but she didn't respond. When the door shut behind him, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The next night he returned, just as he had said he would, but something was different. This time he didn't sit at the bar. Instead, he took a seat at one of the empty tables, watching her with quiet patience. It wasn't the usual smoldering intensity she had come to expect from him. It was something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she wasn't ready to admit. She poured a drink for a regular before finally walking over. "You're in the wrong seat." Damian leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the table. "Maybe I wanted a different view tonight." She fought the way her stomach flipped at his words. Drinking alone at a table instead of a bar still means you're drinking alone. He tilted his head slightly. "Unless you sit down." Vanessa hesitated. She shouldn't. She had a business to run, people to serve. But she found herself pulling out the chair across from him. The moment she sat, the air between them shifted. The usual tension was there, humming beneath the surface, but this time it was accompanied by something else, something softer. Damian watched her carefully. "You never take breaks, do you?" She shrugged. "Running this place doesn't leave much time for that." He nodded as if he understood, and she supposed in some way he did. For a while they sat in companionable silence, the noise of the bar fading into the background. Then, after a long moment, Damian spoke again. I want to help. Vanessa's fingers curled against the edge of the table. I don't need saving. I didn't say you did. His voice was calm, steady. But that doesn't mean you have to do everything alone, she exhaled, shaking her head. You don't get it, Damian. This bar, it's not just about keeping it running. It's about proving that I can. His expression didn't waver. Who are you trying to prove it to? The question lodged itself in her throat. She could have lied, could have brushed it off. But something about the way Damian looked at her made it impossible. My father, she finally admitted. Even though he's gone, Damian didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked like he understood far too well. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now. Holding on to something that strongly, it can be a beautiful thing. But it can also keep you from seeing what's right in front of you. Vanessa swallowed hard. And what's right in front of me? His gaze didn't waver. A future you don't have to build alone. She didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know how to let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight every battle by herself. Before she could say anything, the door swung open and Eric walked in. Vanessa stiffened. Damian's entire posture shifted, his jaw tightening as he turned to face the man who had been nothing but a thorn in Vanessa's side. Eric's eyes flicked between them before he let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. Well, I see you've got yourself a bodyguard. Vanessa stood, shoulders squared. If you're here to make another offer, you're wasting your time. Eric sighed, shaking his head. You're being stubborn, Vanessa. You know as well as I do that this place is a sinking ship. You're just delaying the inevitable. Damian rose from his seat, his presence alone enough to make Eric take a half step back. She's not selling. Eric scoffed. And what? You think you can stop me? Damian didn't flinch. I don't need to stop you. She already has. Eric's expression darkened, but he didn't push further. He simply exhaled sharply before turning on his heel and walking out. Vanessa let out a breath and turned to Damian. You didn't have to do that. He met her gaze, unwavering. Yes, I did. And this time she didn't try to argue, she just let herself believe it. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't standing alone. Vanessa had spent her entire life guarding herself, keeping people at a safe distance. But Damian had shattered through her walls with quiet persistence, with unwavering support that she hadn't even realized she needed. And now, as she stood beside him in the dimly lit bar, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want him to walk away. The confrontation with Eric had left an unspoken tension hanging between them, a weight neither of them acknowledged but both clearly felt. Damian hadn't just defended her, he had planted himself firmly in her life as if he had no intention of leaving, and she wasn't sure she wanted him to. The bar had closed for the night, the tables wiped down, the chairs stacked neatly. But Vanessa lingered, unable to bring herself to send Damian away. He leaned against the counter, his sleeves rolled up, his watch glinting under the soft glow of the overhead lights. She turned, bracing herself against the bar, studying him. You should go home. His gaze didn't waver. Do you want me to? Vanessa hesitated, gripping the edge of the counter. The truth sat heavy on her tongue, but saying it felt dangerous. She had spent too long convincing herself she didn't need anyone, that wanting someone needing them was a weakness. But Damian wasn't just someone. She swallowed hard, then shook her head. No. Something shifted in his expression, a quiet understanding settling between them. He stepped forward, slowly closing the space between them. You don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice low. Her pulse pounded in her throat. I don't know how to do it any other way. Damian reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Then let me show you. Vanessa exhaled, her walls cracking, crumbling. And for the first time in years, she let them. She leaned into him, her body instinctively seeking his, and when his arms wrapped around her, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Safe. For a long moment they stood there in silence, the weight of unspoken emotions thick between them. Then Damian pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. "I want to help you keep this place," he said. "Not because I think you need saving, but because it matters to you, and what matters to you matters to me." Her throat tightened. She had spent so long fighting to hold onto the bar, to prove to herself and the world that she could do it alone. But Damian wasn't asking to take that from her. He was offering to stand beside her. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Damian didn't just offer to help, he threw himself into the fight with the same relentless determination that had built his empire. He dug into the financials, found loopholes in Eric's acquisitions, and called in favors Vanessa hadn't even known he had. And through it all, he stayed. Late nights turned into early mornings. Business discussions blurred into stolen moments, her fingers brushing against his when they reached for the same document, his touch lingering at the small of her back as he passed her behind the bar. They weren't just fighting for the bar. They were building something together. Then one evening, Damian walked in with a folder in hand, his expression unreadable. Vanessa set down the glass she had been cleaning, bracing herself. "What is it?" she asked. He placed the folder on the bar, sliding it toward her. "It's over." Her heart pounded as she flipped it open, scanning the documents, and then she saw it, legal proof that Eric's attempts to seize the bar had failed. He had no claim over her father's legacy. Vanessa's breath caught. She looked up at Damian, emotions crashing over her in waves. Relief, gratitude. Something deeper, something she wasn't afraid to name anymore. She stepped around the bar, and before she could second-guess herself, she threw her arms around him. Damian's arms wrapped around her instantly, holding her as tightly as she held him. "You did it," she whispered against his chest. "We did it," he corrected. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her pulse racing. "You stayed." His fingers traced the side of her face, his touch reverent. "I wasn't going anywhere." And then he kissed her. It wasn't hesitant or uncertain. It was a promise sealed between them in the quiet hum of the bar that had brought them together. Weeks turned into months. Vanessa had spent so long thinking she would have to fight every battle alone, but Damian had proven her wrong. He had become a part of her world, seamlessly intertwining his life with hers in a way that felt effortless. One evening, after closing, he took her hand and led her to the rooftop above the bar. The city lights stretched out before them, casting a golden glow against the night sky. And then he got down on one knee. Vanessa's breath hitched as he pulled a ring from his pocket, his gaze steady. "I didn't just fight for this bar," he said. "I fought for you, for us. And I want to keep fighting for the rest of my life." Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't hesitate. "Yes." Damian slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he never planned to let go. And he never would. Their wedding was small but perfect. The bar was closed for the night, transformed into a space filled with soft candlelight and the people who mattered most. Damian stood at the altar, looking at her as if she was the only thing that had ever made sense. And when they said their vows, Vanessa knew without a doubt she had found her home. Not just in the bar, in him.